We've covered a lot of aspects of using Bootstrap already, and in the last video we created a simple footer section. So in this video we're going to have a little look at utilizing or building forms with Bootstrap. So I'm going to build a new page for this. So I'm just going to I'm going to copy the About Us page, and I'm going to call this form. I'll load that up in my editor. Okay, so I want to keep the nav bar for my form, and I want to keep a container. So, and I want to keep the footer too. So I'm just going to, obviously that's my container, that's my footer. There's another div here. So I just want to make sure I've got a container for my form, and I've still got the footer. So you can see when I click here, it represents that part there. Okay, and then the footer's there, and obviously my nav bar is up the top. So I'm just making sure that all my divs are starting and closing correctly. So now I can start working in this section here. Okay, so I want to build a form. Let's see what Bootstrap says or gives us about forms. So Bootstrap. Okay, so I go into the documentation, and I'm looking for components, and I'm looking for forms. There we go. So again, please read this page, pause and read this page, give yourself an overview of using forms. But we're going to go down to this first form, start here, and we're going to copy this code, and we're going to place it right in the middle, right there. So the form starts and ends. It's inside the container, so it's going to be nice and contained in the center, hopefully. So I press save there, and we go back to our home page. Obviously now we're going to need a link to that form page. So this page is called form.html. So if we remember, we need to copy the li to li. So that was the About Us page. So I'm going to add a new page here and call it form. And this is going to be linking to form.html. So that should work nicely. I refresh the page, click on form, that takes us to the page where the form is. So notice the form takes the shape of the whole container. So the container starts out here and it ends here, the container. So it's taken the whole form. So maybe what we need to do is change the size of that eventually. But let's just look to see how this form is created or how it's made up. So we've got form. So you can see that a form resides inside the form tags, and we can see here we've got 1, 2, 3 sets of divs and a button. So you can see that every set of divs starts with a class form group. So in general terms, the form group refers to a section. So here we've got the section here that's got the email to will never share your email and password. So essentially what we've got here, if we go back, is we've got a section here. That's one section. This is 2 sections, right? That and the input. This is 3 sections. And then we've got the submit. So there's a few sections, and what's happening here, each section is building on top of each other. So if I wanted to build a new section underneath this form group, just remove the details here. I need to start off with a form group, and if I just type something random there, so all I've got is a new div class form group underneath this form group here, div. And then if I just try that, it should lay nicely underneath. So you can see what that is controlling. Okay, so that's the form group. So you can see here we've got some label tags. So it says for equals example input email 1, and it says email address. So that's the label. And then we have an input. So as you might imagine, this input is referring to this input here. And you can see that the label is referring to this element here. So we have a label, we then have an input, and then we have small. So small here is referring to some text. So it's some small text. Going back here, you can see it's this text right here. And these elements are all nicely within this form group. So everything's being placed on top of each other, and it's all formed inside of this form group class. So it works the same here again. So we've got a label, password, and then we have an input. So again, we've got the label and we've got an input. And then moving down, we've then got this input, this checkbox input, and then we have a label underneath that. So this is the other way around this time. So we've got the input and then the label, and then that finishes, and then we have the button. So this then refers to that button there. And of course we can control, if you remember back to buttons, we mentioned that we can change the color of the button if we wanted to, and obviously we can change any of this text if we wanted to too. So that would be how to build a very simple form with email and password. Obviously you can extend these like I've already shown you. So if you wanted password and you had to type in a special word, for example, well, I could just copy and paste that, obviously making sure it's from the form group start to end. And then I go back here, and there we go, we've got a special word. So notice that when I click on the actual word, it also puts the cursor inside the input. Now, when I do it here, it doesn't do that. So notice when I click on password, there we go. When I click on email, there we go. But on Word, it doesn't do that. Now, the reason why that is how this is labeled out. So this label has this for and then the name example input email 1. And what this is doing here is linking this label to this input. Notice here it says ID, and the ID name is exactly the same as this for here. So this is linking this to the input form, and this is why when you click on the name, it puts the cursor in the section. But it doesn't do it here, notice, because if you go back to where we added this word, notice that yes, this for does match that, but it's probably conflicting with this one here. So if we change this to ASD and change this ID to ASD, we now make this, we made a unique ID. If we go back and then refresh and click on Word, you'll notice that it works. So we now know the dynamics of that too and how that works. So let's now just expand upon this. At this point, we just need to go through some of the other options available. So one of them would be a drop-down select box. So I'm just going to paste this piece of code here. Now, again, this piece of code, if I go back to my forms, I can see it's right here, this drop-down. So I'm just going to select this this form group from there to there, press Control, and then go back, and obviously I've entered it just below this form group here. And obviously these are the options for the drop down, and this is the label. So going back to my form now, so you can see now I've got a new form group, example select, and I can now select in a nice drop down. So likewise, if I'm looking for something else, so for example I wanted a text area where I could write multiple lines of text, the example's just here. So again, I just need the div from the form group to the end, and then I copy that, and then I'm going to put mine just below this option here. So I just make sure it's the form group div to div, and this is using a text area. Notice that we've got the text area, and we've defined how many rows. So this refers to how many rows we want viewable. So if I type in 10, that's now going to give me 10 viewable rows. There we go, 10 viewable rows. And obviously I'll just change that back to 3, and you can see how that is changed. So that gives me some it gives me a way of controlling the size of that. Of course, you've got this drop down or this drag, so I can expand to more than 10 words. I can write a lot of text in that area. So other options you might want to include, it's just a case of going through here and having a look. So this is a little bit about sizing, so we can size the form if we want to. Okay, so this is using these classes here, and it gives you an example of how to use those different classes. And if we move down, we've got some different options. I'm looking for a simple example here of a placeholder to write some text. So this is just going to be a simple input type text. So we're going to use that. So form group div start to div end. We're going to place that just underneath this one here and see what that looks like. There we go. So this is a single kind of line. This one here. Sorry. This is a simple input field for text. Okay, so you may have noticed that you've got these, for example here, there's already something entered in the actual form box. So in order to get something to appear initially, we use this placeholder option. So if I copy this placeholder option, let me go to my, it's getting difficult to read now, but here I'm in my example label. Now you can see that there is a placeholder option here, and we've included this parameter attribute. I think of the right word in a second to explain this. And you can see that it's got a placeholder already. So we can do the same thing for example, the email. So we've got the input. So we make sure we're in this input. So it starts here and it ends right there. So we just extend that by pasting in the placeholder equals another input placeholder. So if I go back now to my example, so there should be something that appears right there. So there's my placeholder. And as soon as I click on the box and start typing, obviously it disappears. So that's a simple example of a placeholder. So the last thing to consider is, well, how do I get this smaller? At the moment, it's using the whole container. So how can we get this to rescale? Let's build a new row. And we'll close that off. And then we'll build a new div. Class equals. And we'll finish that. So we're going to have this form center on the page, and we're going to then control the size of the form. So we've got a div, we've got a new row, sorry, and then a new set of div for a class here. So what we're going to do inside of this class row, we're going to place justify content MD center. So if you're going back to a previous video, I mentioned how the containers can be manipulated at a certain size, or they can change. So what we're saying here is that when our container is, well, let's go back to the information here. So when our page is 768 pixels and higher, what's going to happen in our code is that we're going to justify the content inside of or this div. In this case, this is the content. We're going to justify this in the middle, in the center, while it's at 768 pixels. The screen size is higher than that number. But as soon as it goes below that, it's just going to default back to the previous, which is that the form is going to be the size or the width of the screen. So that's going to nicely scale down to mobile view. So what we do here is we'll say col MD. So we're then going to define the size of this. So Remember, we've got a 12 grid system here, so we're going to apply 6. And now what I'm going to do is put the form inside of here. So this form's a form. So I'm going to close that and put the form inside of this div. Okay, so now it's inside. Just double check that. Okay, so the form's inside of this div here, and then we've got a new row. So let's see that in action. There we go. So everything is nicely centered. And just to show you that you can now control the size. So if I change that to 8, we can now control the width of our form. Obviously it's still centered, but notice if I then put it down to about 4, refresh. If I were to now scale this page, F12, you can see that it will then move back when it gets below that number. So below 768, you can see that 768, here we go. You can see it now moves back to full screen and it goes nicely into mobile view. So there we go. So that's how to control the size of your form, center it to the page, and have it look nice. Obviously, we need some padding now up the top, so we can quickly do that. So if you remember, we can probably achieve that in the row here, or in the container. So padding top, I'm just going to give it a 5, so the maximum. So there we go. So now we have a little bit of padding. So let's get out of this mode. See a little bit of padding now. At the bottom we don't need it. And there we have it. So go through and read the form page. Have a look at the other parameters that are available. Moving on from this, you can see that column sizing can be controlled using column widths. If you wanted to put columns next to each other, for example. So that's a little bit more advanced. So by all means have a read through. So you should understand the basic concepts now of utilizing or building forms in Bootstrap.